You think you know what a dire wolf is? The massive black wolf from a fantasy series. The enormous, fearless pack hunter that takes down anything it chooses. The apex predator of ancient America. Big, aggressive, unstoppable. The wolf taken to its logical extreme. You have a picture in your head. It is wrong. Not because the dire wolf was less impressive than the image, but because the real animal was something so different from that image, so precisely built for a world so unlike anything alive today, that the fiction did it a disservice in almost every particular. Its name is Einocion dirus, not Canis dirus, the way it was classified for most of scientific history. Einocion, a separate genus, distinct from wolves, distinct from dogs, distinct from any living carnid. And that reclassification, made definitive by a landmark 2021 study in the journal Nature, changes everything. Because everything we assumed about the dire wolf, its behavior, its hunting strategy, its relationship to other predators, its extinction, was built on the assumption that it was a wolf. A big wolf. A wolf on steroids. It was not. It was something that looked like a wolf, the way a thylacine looks like a dog. Similar body plan, arrived at through convergent evolution, concealing an animal that was, underneath the resemblance, genuinely different. Start with what the 2021 study actually found. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from 5 dire wolf specimens, ranging in age from 13,000 to 50,000 years old, drawn from locations across North and South America. The results were unambiguous. Dire wolves and grey wolves had been genetically isolated from each other for at least 5.7 million years. They had diverged so long ago that when grey wolves and coyotes arrived in North America from Eurasia and shared the continent with dire wolves for thousands of years, they never interbred. Not once. The genetic evidence shows zero hybridization. This is not what happens when 2 closely related animals share a landscape. This is what happens when 2 animals that look similar are actually so different, at the level of chromosomes and reproductive biology, that interbreeding is not possible. Dire wolves were not American wolves. They were something else entirely, wearing a wolf's coat. Now, the body. Because the body is where Einocion dirus departs most dramatically from the animal popular culture invented, and where the real story of what made it dangerous begins to take shape. Dire wolves were heavy. A fully grown adult weighed between 150 and 175 pounds, 68 and 79 kilograms, roughly 25% heavier than a modern grey wolf of similar length. But the weight was distributed differently. The legs were shorter relative to body size. The chest was broader. The neck was thicker. The overall silhouette was stockier, lower to the ground, built for power rather than the long-distance coursing speed that defines modern wolves. This was not an animal built to run prey down across open plains over miles of sustained pursuit. They are the architecture of something that closes fast over a short distance, that uses strength and mass in the final engagement, rather than endurance across a long one. Dire wolves were ambush specialists with a pack structure that allowed them to overwhelm prey through numbers and coordinated force rather than exhaustion. The skull. This is where the full picture of what Einocion dirus actually was becomes clear, and where every other predator in Pleistocene North America had reason to pay attention. The dire wolf's skull was proportionally larger than any modern wolf's, wider across the zygomatic arches, deeper in the mandible, built to support jaw muscles of extraordinary development. The teeth were larger than a grey wolf's in absolute terms and differently shaped. The carnassials, the shearing teeth that all carnivores use for slicing through meat, were massive. But what defines the dire wolf's dental equipment is the crushing teeth, the molars and premolars positioned behind the carnassials, which in a modern wolf are used for processing bone after the carnassials have done the main work. In Einocion dirus, these teeth were enlarged and reinforced to a degree that no living wolf approaches. The bite force of a dire wolf has been estimated at roughly 1,646 pounds per square inch, 11,350 newtons. For comparison, a modern grey wolf produces approximately 400 pounds per square inch, 2,760 newtons. The dire wolf's bite was more than 4 times stronger. It was not built to chase. It was built to crush. Crush what, specifically? This is the question that unlocks everything about Enosiodirus. Not just what it ate, but why it was built the way it was, and why every other predator in its world had to factor it into every decision about food. The prey base of Pleistocene North America was a megafauna assemblage unlike anything alive today. Western horses, Equus occidentalis, North American camels, Camelops hesternus, giant ground sloths reaching 13,000 pounds, 6,000 kilograms, ancient bison with horn spans of 7 feet, 2.1 meters. These were not the prey animals that modern wolves evolved alongside in Eurasia. They were larger, differently built, and in many cases, more heavily muscled and thicker boned than any ungulate alive today. Hunting them, killing them, and extracting the maximum caloric value from a carcass of that scale required tools that modern wolves simply do not have. The bone-crushing dentition of the dire wolf was not an incidental feature. It was the answer to a specific question asked by an ecosystem full of enormous, thick-boned prey. How do you access the marrow inside a leg bone from a horse 3 times the size of a modern horse, with a bite force 4 times that of any living wolf? The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles have given us more dire wolf fossils than any other site on Earth. Over 4,000 individual specimens, representing at least 1,600 individual animals, pulled from the asphalt deposits over a century of excavation. This is, by an enormous margin, the largest sample of any Pleistocene predator in the fossil record. The La Brea dire wolves show pathology, healed injuries, broken legs that fused and the animal kept walking on, spinal injuries, damage to the skull from something that hit it hard enough to fracture bone, but not hard enough to kill. Injuries that, in a solitary predator or a loosely social one, would typically be fatal. You cannot hunt a ground sloth with a broken leg. You cannot bring down a horse with a fractured skull. If you are alone, these injuries end your life. The La Brea specimens survived them. Multiple individuals, multiple injury types, all healed. The implication is direct. Dire wolves fed injured members of the pack, not occasionally, repeatedly, across individuals, at a frequency that shows up statistically in a sample of thousands of specimens. This was not incidental tolerance. This was a social system sophisticated enough to sustain animals that could not contribute to the hunt. Modern wolves do this, but the frequency and severity of healed injuries in dire wolves exceeds what the modern wolf record shows, which suggests a social cohesion and group investment in individual survival which may have been even more developed in Enosiodirus than in its living lookalike. The pack size. This is where dire wolves separate completely from every other predator in Pleistocene North America, and where the terror the title names becomes not an individual quality, but an ecological one, because the most dangerous thing about Enosiodirus was never the animal, it was the number. Modern wolf packs typically number between 5 and 15 individuals. Large packs of 20 or more exist, but are unusual, representing exceptional circumstances of prey density or territory conditions. The La Brea deposits, analyzed for the density of simultaneous occupation at kill sites, the ratios of adult to juvenile specimens, and the pattern of injuries consistent with large group competition at carcasses, suggests that dire wolf packs may have regularly numbered 20 to 30 individuals. Some evidence points to even larger aggregations. At particularly productive feeding sites, temporary coalitions of multiple packs drawn by the presence of an enormous carcass, or a seasonal prey concentration. A pack of 30 dire wolves, each weighing 160 pounds, 72 kilograms, each with a bite force 4 times that of a grey wolf, operating with the social coordination that the healed injury evidence implies, was not simply a large predator. It was a moving siege engine, an organized force capable of targeting prey that no individual predator in its ecosystem could challenge alone. This is why every other predator had reason to be concerned. Not because the dire wolf could defeat a cave lion or a Smilodon in individual combat. It probably could not. The cave lion was heavier, faster, with forelimbs capable of strikes that would kill a wolf outright. Smilodon's canines, up to 11 inches, 28 centimeters long, could deliver a killing bite to prey far larger than a dire wolf. But neither the cave lion nor Smilodon came in packs of 30. The terror of a Noscyon was not in any individual animal. It was in the arithmetic of what 30 of them meant at a carcass. The fossil record captures this tension directly. Smilodon specimens from Brea show healed bite wounds, consistent with the tooth spacing of large canids. Cave lion bones show similar evidence. These were not the wounds of prey animals. They were the wounds of predators that had contested a kill with something that bit back in numbers. The competition between Noscyon and the other apex predators of the Pleistocene was not a hierarchy with a clear winner. It was a constant negotiation, conducted in teeth and threat and the presence of numbers, in which the outcome depended on who arrived at the carcass first, how many they were, and how hungry the other side was. There is a detail in the Brea record that reframes the entire picture of direwolf dominance. The ratio of direwolf specimens to Smilodon specimens at Brea is approximately 3-1. For every Smilodon that died in the asphalt, 3 direwolves did. This is not evidence that direwolves were more common in the surrounding ecosystem. Population density estimates suggest Smilodon may actually have been more abundant in the landscape outside of Brea. The ratio reflects something else entirely. Direwolves came to contested feeding sites in groups, large enough that the risk to any individual was lower than the reward of group feeding. They lost individuals to the tar. They came anyway, the next day and the day after, because the pack replaced what the individual lost. A pack of 30 can absorb losses that would destroy a smaller, less cohesive social group. Smilodon was more cautious. It approached the tar pits less frequently, risked less, and appears in the fossil record there at a lower rate, despite being a successful and widespread predator. It won individual confrontations and lost the war of attrition at contested carcasses. Numbers, persistence, and social resilience were what the direwolf had that nothing else in its world could match. The extinction of Noscyon, approximately 9,500 years ago, has a simple explanation and a complicated one. The simple explanation is that the prey base collapsed. An animal built for a specific world cannot survive the removal of that world, no matter how well adapted it is within it. And the dire wolf was built for its world in ways that left no flexibility for a different one. Between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, the megafauna of North America vanished. Horses, camels, ground sloths, mammoths, mastodons, gone within a geological instant. The dire wolf was a specialist. Its bone-crushing dentition, its stocky pursuit and overwhelm hunting strategy, its pack structure calibrated to bringing down enormous prey, all of it was optimized for a prey base that no longer existed. Grey wolves survived the extinction because they were generalists. Smaller prey, more flexible diet, longer legs built for the pursuit of deer and elk-sized animals that fled rather than turned to fight. They could hunt rabbits when deer were scarce. They could switch between prey types across seasons. The direwolf could not pivot. The bone-crushing teeth were specialized. The heavy body was specialized. The pack hunting strategy calibrated to enormous, thick-boned prey was specialized. Every advantage it had was an advantage in a specific context, and that context had ceased to exist. Generalists survive extinction events. Specialists do not. The dire wolf was the most successful specialist in the history of North American predation, and that success was precisely what made survival impossible when the world it had specialized for was gone. The complicated explanation is humans. Modern humans lived in North America approximately 15,000 years ago, and the megafauna extinctions track the colonization front in ways that climate alone cannot explain. The prey that dire wolves depended on had survived previous interglacials, previous warmings. What they had not survived before was a predator that attacked from a distance with projectile weapons, that hunted strategically rather than by ambush, that could follow herds across landscapes and selectively remove the large, slow, thick-boned animals that were precisely the animals a Nocion needed most. Humans did not hunt dire wolves. They did not need to. They hunted the horses and the camels and the ground sloths, and the dire wolf's food supply contracted beneath it until the packs were too hungry and too dispersed to sustain the social structure that had made them formidable in the first place. Consider what the social structure meant in its final years. A pack of 30 that loses its prey base does not smoothly downsize to a pack of 10 hunting smaller animals. It fragments. The bonds that sustained injured members, that coordinated attacks on enormous prey, that gave the pack its arithmetic advantage over every competitor, those bonds require feeding, require success. A social system built for abundance does not gracefully adapt to scarcity. It collapses. And when the pack collapses, the individual direwolf that remains is exactly what every other predator on the continent could handle. One animal, 160 pounds, 72 kilograms, with teeth built for bone it cannot find and legs too short for the prey that remains. The last dire wolves died alone, probably. Not in packs of 30 at a carcass, not in the coordinated, bone-crushing, socially sophisticated way that the Brea record shows them at their peak. In reduced groups, in a landscape that had lost the animals they were built to hunt, competing with grey wolves that could eat what the dire wolves could not, unable to interbreed with them, unable to acquire through hybridization any of the flexibility that might have helped. They were too specialized in too many ways simultaneously. The body, the teeth, the pack structure, the prey. All of it was one system, and the system required a specific world to function. That world closed. Here is what the Brea tar pits hold. Not bones in sediment the way most fossil sites preserve their animals. Bones in asphalt, dense and three-dimensional and intact. Pulled from the ground in a city of 4 million people, studied in a museum that sits in the middle of that city, surrounded by the traffic and the noise of a world built on top of the landscape those animals once dominated. You can stand at the edge of one of the active excavation pits at Brea and look down through layers of black asphalt at bones that are still being removed, catalogued, studied. Somewhere in those layers are more direwolf specimens than exist of any other Pleistocene predator anywhere on Earth. More than 4,000 individuals. More animals than you could count in a day, preserved in the same substance that killed them, in a city that did not exist when they died, in the middle of a continent that has not seen them in nearly 10,000 years. A Nocion was not a wolf. It was something older, stranger, more precisely adapted to a world we can only reconstruct from the evidence it left behind. It terrified the other predators of its time, not because any individual dire wolf was the most dangerous animal on the Pleistocene steppe, but because it never came alone, because the pack that arrived at a carcass was not 5 or 10 animals, but 20 or 30, and each of those animals had a bite that could turn a leg bone to splinters, and each of them had been kept alive through injuries that would have killed a lesser social animal by packmates who chose to feed them rather than abandon them. That is what it actually was, not the fantasy version, not the giant black wolf of television, something older and stranger and more interesting than that. A social system disguised as a predator, running on a continent it dominated for hundreds of thousands of years, optimized to the last detail for a world that disappeared in the time it takes a species to blink. It never had a chance to adapt. The world it was built for ended too fast. And the bones it left behind, thousands of them, pressed into the asphalt under a city it never saw coming, are still the most complete record of any large Pleistocene predator on Earth, still being studied, still yielding new information, still telling the story of an animal that has been misunderstood for most of the time we have known about it. We called it a wolf because it looked like one. That was our mistake, not its.